The first and second. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? Motion carries. Do we have any comments about the meeting minutes from May 30th? I'll accept a motion to approve the meeting minutes from May 30th, 2023.
I'll make a motion to approve the minutes for that date in 2023.
We have a first and second. Any discussion on the meeting minutes? All in favor, say aye. Opposed, say nay. Abstentions? Motion carries. We have two people today for public comment. And if you could come up and sit to the right of Jennifer, that'd be great. Pat Anderson, we have 5 minutes for public comment.
Thank you. So my name is Pat Anderson. I'm a resident of Scappoose, and I've been in Scappoose for about 30 years. We moved out here because of the small rural-like community, like a lot of people. And, you know, with time, things are changing. And so I like to try to stay informed and try to stay proactive in helping guide change. So that's why I'm here tonight. I do take interest in how we are planning to make sure that we are retaining as much of the desired attributes that have attracted us as well as other people here as assets that Scappoose has. So with regard to the 50-year plan and the special attention on the development code changes and the land use efficiency measures, you know, I understand and appreciate the need for planning and the need to make a good faith effort to outline the intent on how we will accommodate future growth. Yet I do have several concerns. So based on what I have read and heard listening to all the recorded meetings, I agree that there needs to be a lot of strategizing and planning to outline how we are going to accomplish our vision and our goals. What I do not agree with is the immediate need to make these changes to our zoning and development codes now as part of our planning. It seems like we are getting the cart before the horse. What I do not see in anything that I have read is a comprehensive plan that integrates each of the planning silos into one cohesive plan that are linked together. And that's like the parks and recreation planning, commercial and retail planning, the schools, residential planning, so on and so forth. So approving these zoning and development changes now, I believe, would open the door for developers to start constructing high density homes before we are ready to support it. And shouldn't this high density residential plan be done in coordination with any infrastructure plan? You know, and what and where is that plan that demonstrates how this residential plan will be supported? And also, where is the plan on how our infrastructure will be expanded to support this higher density population and housing? So just based on just normal observation, Highway 30 seems like it's reaching its capacity just due to growth in all the other communities. People are still having to travel down to Portland and other areas because there is no big business here to employ people. So there will probably need to be expansion there. I don't see any development of any kind of commercial operations or anything down on at the new airport facility. You know, so where is that the funding for this infrastructure going to come from? We have a rail system that bisects the city. What's the plan to deal with that? Because it poses its own set of constraints with regard to traffic, with regard to emergency response, so on and so forth. And I've also noticed that an uptick in the rail activity. So what would happen in the event that we have some sort of a catastrophic event with the rail system? So, you know, and then I guess one of the other things, you know, knowing that I only have 5 minutes, that's near and dear to my heart is the lack of sidewalks that we have in our community currently. And adding more housing and more cars and on-street parking, it's already a danger to walk the streets. I walk the streets regularly. It's always been unsafe just because we have no sidewalks. Now I don't take routes just because I'm afraid. I no longer go down Columbia, down to 4th, down to 6th, and take high school way up to Highway 30 and back because it's basically taking my life into my hands. So anyway, I just wanted to make sure that I wanted to come here and state these things because they are concerns. And I've had heard them brought up in one of the hearings. Um, but one of the things that also concerns me is just based back to the fact that the taxpayers, the property owners pay, they carry that tax burden for any infrastructure growth. Um, Columbia County is not a wealthy community, and so I just think if we put that cart before the horse, the taxpayers are going to be bearing the brunt of it. People won't be able to pay their taxes. They're already struggling as it is. So I just ask that as we plan for this 50-year plan, let's do it slowly and thoughtfully and effectively, and just make sure that what we're doing now is not going to be putting anything that we need in the future at risk.
Thank you, Pat.
Thank you.
The second person is Marissa Jacobs, and you have 5 minutes, please.
Hello, I'm Marissa. I'm a resident of Scappoose. Also a 3-year planning commissioner as well as a budget committee member. So tonight, just so we're all clear, I'm speaking as a resident and not in any of my committee capacities. So I've been actively following the 50-year committee, and I realize this will be going to the planning commission as well as to city council. But again, I'm speaking as a resident. So as I've been tracking the progress, I think first and foremost, thank you all for being on the committee. It's like a 3-year journey, so I appreciate all of you doing this. Second, I also really do appreciate all the work that's been going into it, that Lori's been leading. It's been really fascinating to be able to see all of these assessments and analysis to help pull it all together. Where I have just some questions I would like to pose to this committee for further consideration as you're working through this. You know, to sort of what I heard Pat say, yes, and one of the things is like our growth. So I realized that we went through a growth spurt through a course of like 7 to 10 years. And when you look at what our population expectations are, to go 10% more, I think, or no, it was 20%. And Brian, you were talking about this in the last meeting. To grow 20,000 more people, 2,000 more people, it's looking at close to maybe 20 years until we get there. It seems a bit hasty for us to be making code changes for high density for something that may not be coming to fruition for us for, say, maybe even 15 to 20 years. It seems like slow, progressive growth is really more what the community wants and prefers from just me being out and about and talking with neighbors. So I would ask why the need to do high density housing? What is the trade-offs going to be? And further to what Councilor Santiago had mentioned in the last session was, you know, she's a visual person. I'm a visual person. I know a lot of people are. It would be really helpful to be able to kind of see this 2D exercise come more into life in a 3D model. And what I mean by that is not necessarily pictures of what development would look like, but when we start talking about we're going to dissect up what our buildable lands are, what is going to go where? And how does that tie into our vision of how we want to grow and attract people to come visit and spend their dollars here so we can generate some income outside of homeowners and renters being here? How does making all of these changes tie back to our vision and what is available for us to available land to grow into and where things should be, where services can be located in relation to housing projects? That would be, I think, very helpful and really impactful for the community to be able to see that, okay, if we were going to make these high density changes, here's where we're planning that where these types of structures could go. One thing that was really interesting back in 2014, I think it was, or 15, the Portland Magazine had published a write-up of what downtown Portland's project, their growth model was. They actually had a 2-page layout of the entire downtown, and they showed where like the 26 building structures were going. That's what I mean by like that's something that's impactful and visually helpful for people of the community to kind of understand. So again, thank you for your time for doing this work, really important, and thank you for being advocates for the citizens.
Marissa.
Thank you. Then we'll go to Lori with a review of the project to date.
All right, good evening. Thank you all for being here. I'm just going to say a couple things tonight before I hand this over to Beth and Heather. So it's been about 2 months since our last meeting, so I won't go into a long kind of project recap again, just kind of touching on sort of the overarching points of the project. So the project has been a council goal since 2020. And the intent really is to have a long range look at our land needs so that we can establish urban reserves, which would accommodate our 50-year land need, and then also evaluate the need for an urban growth boundary expansion, which would meet our 20-year land need. So both of those items will be accomplished by this project. And then, as you know, we would be updating the development code and comprehensive plan in support of the studies that have been completed. So that's the economic opportunities analysis and the housing capacity analysis. These all build together to bring us to what we need to basically justify our urban growth boundary expansion. The plan, this overall plan is expected to be completed mid-2024-ish, with the adoption process occurring in the fall of 2024. So all that to say, we are a little more than halfway through the project, and appreciate you all sticking with us for this. It's a long haul. And I'll go ahead and hand it over to Beth and Heather now for their presentation.
And Jay's going to get our presentation up because evidently I didn't listen well enough.
I have a comment.
We're on.
Hey, Lori.
Yes.
So I've talked to a bunch of people about this, and even in city council, and they are kind of under the assumption that we're doing a 50-year visioning plan. That we're going to come out of this and we're going to have everything dialed, like our vision for what our town's going to be. And what you just described, and you've been consistent with this, is it's a 50-year land need plan.
Correct. It's very land use focused.
So I think that has to be clarified to the citizens and to the council, because, and just calling it the 50-year land need plan, I think would clarify a lot of things, because I think people are looking for answers out of this that may not come. And like you've been very consistent from the get-go, but I think when you see 50-year plan, you're kind of thinking this, maybe something else.
Sure. We're going to do a little write-up for our next newsletter. I'm hoping we can get it in time so we could make some clarifications that this is a land use focused plan with these particular outcomes. The council at the time when we put the scope together was very aware of what was included in that scope. We brought it to them in a work session. So, I don't know exactly who you've been speaking with, but the sitting councilors at that time, in my mind, were clear on what the outcomes were. So I couldn't necessarily speak to that, but we can try moving forward to make that a little more clear.
Good evening. So we are going to continue the conversations we've been having about some of the code changes, and there's some updates from what's required. And then Heather's got some updates based on what we discussed last time. I'm going to hand this over to Heather in just a moment. Here's a reminder of our short-term schedule for the rest of this year and heading into next year. We are expecting the comprehensive plan policy changes. We'll be bringing those to you sometime here in September and in through October. Continuing discussions of land use efficiency measures. That's really, I think, going to go into September along with the code changes. And then beyond that a little bit. We're working on the urban reserve and urban growth boundary analysis. We'll be updating you on that tonight. And then towards the end of the year and the beginning of next year, we'll be working on the 50-year plan itself, which will be a summary of everything from the housing needs analysis, the economic opportunities analysis on outwards. So we are continuing on what we had discussed before. We're going to start tonight's discussion with some land use changes. We're going to then go to an update on the urban growth boundary analysis and then talk about next steps. I'm going to hand it over to Heather for development code changes.
Thank you, Beth. If we can
Go forward one
Maybe,
slide.
there you go.
So this slide is just a bit of a reminder. This slide was in your packet last meeting. So the 3 different overlapping types of code changes that we are looking at. If you'll just, this has a little bit of animation. Sorry, I could have made that easier. Land use efficiency measures. So those are the types of things that were brought up in public comment and that we talked about at the last meeting regarding lot sizes and how we accommodate for potentially more development of land within our existing urban growth boundary before we're able to then make a case for expanding. So it is a requirement that we do look at these land use efficiency measures at this stage. And I should have pointed out when the schedule was up, but there was the comprehensive plan is being updated concurrently with these development code changes. So it will all go hand in hand and the package will all be completed together. So I'm hoping we're not getting the cart before the horse in that way, and we'll be doing some back checks to make sure that what's being updated in the comprehensive plan is reflective of what's being updated in the development code and vice versa. So just to clarify that, to make sure we are all on board with that.
Question.
Yes.
I'm sorry, I listened in last time and it's hard to ask questions during the listen in.
Sure.
But I believe it was brought up, we're seeing at the highest level, okay, let's make this from X thousand square feet to this 1,000 square feet. And I believe someone on this board's asked, what does that equal? Like, if you look at our land, then, you know, you do the math and you say, well, okay, what is that going to bring us if you do these things? Did you guys go through that?
Yes, and we actually have some slides addressing exactly that. You're just a little ahead.
Well, thank you.
Yes. So in addition to those land use efficiency measures, we also are looking at some code cleanup, some definitions that need to be updated with current state law and best practices. Looking at how we clarify what's being built on a property, that a primary structure comes first before any accessory structures. And then we'll look at our reviews, our land use reviews, and what makes sense for planning commission and city council and staff and those types of things. And then we have this whole category called state mandated updates. There's been some changes even since our last meeting, so we'll go over that in a moment with you as well. But this is where we look at the minimum lot sizes, parking minimums, manufactured home standards and definitions. I don't have any slides this evening on the manufactured home standards, but I did want to clarify that committee member Rosenthal brought up about CC&Rs related to manufactured homes. And we did get clarification from the state that actually CC&Rs can preclude, the CC&Rs that are in place can be used to preclude manufactured homes on individual lots. And I believe we sent you that information as well. Just so everybody, I have that on record because I stated the opposite at the last meeting. Yeah. So we'll go ahead and move to the next slide. There are no other questions about that. And this is the big one, the one we spent a lot of time on last time. I've highlighted some changes, so let me just run through those and then we can talk about these. Excuse me. The single family detached, there's no changes proposed to that type of housing, to any of the minimum lot sizes for that type of housing. Those are being proposed to stay the same. And those are in your R1 zoning district, your R4, and your MH. There are no single family detached in your A1 zoning district. So that's where we get the chance to say, the question was brought up during public comment, where do we do this type of thing? And what we are saying is we're going to do it in A1. We're doing it in our commercial zones as well. You have some mixed use and residential high density provisions to allow that as well. But what we're talking about when we're talking about minimum lot sizes for multifamily, it's in your A1 zoning district. So if you look at your zoning map, you can really pinpoint where those changes are going to apply as far as multifamily. Just starting with the first column with changes, duplexes. At the last meeting, we talked about the R1 reducing duplex minimum lot size to 8,000 instead of what was being proposed, which was 6,000. This is where a change happened. The state passed House Bill 3395 that changed the threshold for who has to permit duplexes on the same size lots as single family detached. It went from 10,000 population to 2,500 population. So all of a sudden, Scappoose is included. Those changes have to be in place by 2025. So they're not immediate, they're not 2023 changes, but they do make sense to keep in this packet because if you're going through hearings in fall of 2024, that will line you up to be making these changes in time to comply with the state law. So that is one where we heard this group say 8,000, we were moving forward with 8,000, and then the state law changed what we could move forward with. So now we have R1 for duplexes at 6,000. R4 for duplexes, same thing. It has to be the same as single family detached. So now it's at 5. This group had said 6. That was what we had. That's what we had on the slide until the state law changed. Manufactured housing, we had said 6. We have to go 5 to comply with the state law. So yes.
So the same with the manufactured home, CCNRs can, in my neighborhood, we don't allow plexes or mobile homes. Is that?
So
the
that
CCNRs
is
can eliminate
different.
Also?
The middle housing provisions are different than the manufactured housing standards. They do not allow CCNRs to, it's a bit nuanced whether the CCNRs that are existing, there could be some flexibility, but what I asked to the state and I pulled up the email, and actually Laura is on the call, so we could actually put her on the spot as well if she's willing to do that. But she actually gave me the difference between HB 4064, which is related to manufactured homes, and that one, CCNRs restricting manufactured home siting is allowed, but HB 2001 prohibited the establishment of new recorded instruments restricting the development of middle housing and ADUs. So specifically, it speaks to new instruments. So I don't know for sure about existing instruments. We'd have to get clarification on
The
that.
instruments, you mean the CCNRs?
CNRs.
Thank you.
Mhm.
So we have to have those CCNRs updated before 2025. Is that what you're saying?
Well, and I'd also, if Laura was able to give any clarification on that, that's really putting her on the spot. We may want to come back to that, but
Oh, there she is.
any thoughts on that, Laura?
Yeah, I'm trying to trying to remember our conversation actually, but yeah, in terms of what the city is required to do about CCNRs, there, these are private covenants, and so this is really more of a private landowner issue. But what's recommended, or what the city could do, is clarify in code that no new CCNRs shall prohibit those things from happening. But if the city doesn't have that in its code, that's not a problem. It's just that can help clarify that after a certain date, those CCNRs would not be allowed to exist. But the city doesn't regulate CCNRs, so I wouldn't worry too much about it. It's just again, that's a private covenant issue.
Thank you, Laura.
So, couple quick questions. So am I understanding it correctly that as far as CCNRs, the city could choose to do something like that for new subdivisions, or they could say, hey, if you don't want duplexes in your subdivision, you don't have to have them. That would be up to you as a private landowner.
It's my understanding you cannot place new CCNRs.
Okay, so that is part of the state statute. Okay. And then the other question is, state mandated. Are those state mandates ironclad, or are they, if we want this or that, that we have to abide to get this or that?
That's a really good question. I would put them in the ironclad category. If your
Okay.
city is over 2,500 in population, you must do this.
Okay, so it's not like, well, we'll withhold, if you
We're
want,
not getting
want-
anything in exchange. It's just a
they'll
statewide.
withhold something there. It's,
Yeah.
so somebody could ultimately sue the city or something if we didn't do this.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So back to this, the duplex standard. So that's where we heard this group, we made the changes of what this group said, and then we had to go back and change it again to comply with the state law. So those yellow highlights in the duplex category are not what this group came up with, but are in fact what we need to move forward with. In the next category with the highlights is what we heard from this group, and that was increasing from we had 5,000 for the middle housing first 2 units in the R4. We increased that to 6,000. Same with the MH zoning district, increasing that to 6,000. And then as far as all of the other changes that are strikeout red and written in black, those were presented at the last SAC meeting and had general agreement with those. So we've left those as they are. And then we just made the note that's highlighted on the bottom that every change that's being shown here was proposed within your 2023 measures to accommodate needed housing report. So Lori just asked us to clarify where these numbers came from. They didn't just appear. They came out of that document that was specific to Scappoose.
Question.
Questions?
Sorry, I'm playing catch up here a little bit.
Please.
So I'm a little confused. I mean, we're spending all this time, money, and effort, and then the state says, well, here's what you should do.
Right.
So why aren't we just following the state mandates?
We are proposing to do that.
Not on the others.
The others are not mandated.
Right. So what I'm saying is, why don't we just follow? The state obviously has a lot of smart people. They look at this stuff. We're only little Scappoose. We've got a very, resource constraints. Why don't we just follow the state guidelines?
And I think part of the answer to that is you are resource constrained, but you have invested resources. So you do have this measures to accommodate need and housing report that looked at this community and looked at the deficit of what types of housing and what price points and what sizes of units could really support the citizens and the workforce of your community and came up with these recommendations. So I think those resources have been well invested to determine how Scappoose could really serve its citizens, as far as citizens that are currently here, citizens who would love to move here, who work here, who work nearby. And so that work has been done. These numbers come from work that was put into that.
Yeah, but I mean, at the same time, the only concrete work of changes, which was again for affordable housing, when we increased the height requirement or the height restriction to like 60 some feet in the industrial zone, and it created the candlelight, and this is what Brian said last week, it's the most expensive per square foot in town. So that's factual proof that changes that were made, I think Eco Northwest actually worked on that study, that didn't concur, that it was, oh, let's do this so that we'll make things cheaper and more accessible. And we have concrete proof it didn't happen. And in fact, you could say that drove up rental prices throughout the whole town because that was the level. Now you're like, okay. So again, I just question, I go, okay, the state is saying at certain population, this is what we should do. The city should do. So this is something that was thought out. But we are saying we're smarter than them, or are we saying that? I mean, that's what I'm questioning, because listening to last session, I heard the words brownie points and well, we have to try, which is not very concrete. So some more clarity here would be helpful, I think, for myself and the citizens.
Got something that might help this discussion. Last time we talked about getting an analysis of the candle that would show us the amount of square feet per unit and that kind of thing, so that people could have a visual concept of what that density level happened, and you guys were going to bring something to give us that information. Instead of continuing right now with what you're talking about, if we saw that analysis of the candle first, that would give us something contextual to look at so that we have a concept of what does this mean? Does this mean density of the candle level? Does this mean the new standards? Does this mean a lot denser than the candle? Does it mean less dense than the candle? What does it
We've
mean?
got that in a few moments.
Okay, so maybe if it's
Yeah.
okay with you, we could come back to this
I
after.
was just
to see
saying
it.
more in the general though. I mean, the state has said, well, these are proper at this population. We're doing something that's not proper.
Well,
I wouldn't interpret it that
No,
way.
no.
The state hasn't weighed in about the city's existing zoning. The state is simply regulating certain types of housing zoning. So what you're required to do when you're looking at an urban growth boundary expansion, you have to look at land use efficiency measures. The middle housing and the multifamily housing changes that are proposed here are relatively modest land use efficiency measures. We've got some other land use efficiency measures that we'll be talking about. You don't have to do these particular pieces, but you do have to show, I think, a good faith effort that the city is doing land use efficiency measures in order to accommodate more housing inside of the existing urban growth boundary. And we'll get to how much this might accommodate in a few minutes. And we're not talking about major changes in zoning as in density as we'll see in a few moments. Another point about the, you pointed out that the housing in the Candle apartments was more costly than in other apartments. And that's certainly true when you have new market rate multifamily housing built. It tends to be more expensive than existing housing. So housing prices for market rate housing go down over time for rentals in general as you have more development come on the market. Before 2016, Scappoose zoning code really restricted the kind of multifamily housing that you could get. So you weren't really working in a market that was functioning. At this point, you're still not working in a market that's functioning, in part because you have so little land where you can build multifamily housing. And that's part of what this project may help to accomplish, is increasing your land base for where you can build multifamily housing. And the type of housing that you're talking about in the Candle, it's at a density that's very different than what we're talking about here in your A1 zone, because this multifamily changes we're talking about are in the A1 zone. So in part, you guys just haven't had much multifamily housing development built over a very long period of time. You got the Candle, you've gotten a few other smaller things a little more recently. And if you want to see housing that's more affordable, then you need additional policies that support development of something other than expensive multifamily housing. So zoning isn't enough. Changes to zoning aren't enough to get affordable multifamily housing. You also need other policies that support that, especially development of housing that's affordable for your lower wage workers. I'm sorry.
I guess the other thing I would just say briefly, thank you, you both explained that very well, is as far as, as thinking maybe we know more than the state, or, having our own opinion about lot sizes and such, we do get to have a say in that. We have concerned citizens here tonight concerned about the increased density. And lucky for us, we do have the opportunity to weigh in on that. It's not that the state is telling us, even our middle housing first 2 units, they're not governing that for us. We get to say. And so to that extent, it's so that each individual city can reflect, the values within that city. So yeah, we might decrease here and there some of these minimum lot sizes. Would we want to just match what, a city like Portland's doing? No, I don't think we'd want to do that. And so it's good that we have the option to see what fits best here, as opposed to just going with, whatever the state figured out for everyone over, 10,000 in population or 2,500 in population. But hopefully that helps clarify that. It's not that they have it figured out and dialed in and we're doing our own thing and maybe that's not right. It's reflecting our local values.
Jeff.
I guess this is kind of a Laurie question, but it could be a Heather. Is most of the existing multifamily housing R4?
So you can't, so multifamily would be 5 or more units. And so R4 is only up to 4 units. And so the multifamily that we have now is in the A1 zone, the high density zone. Currently, as it sits, we have very little A1 zoned land that's available for development, like hardly any. And that's why we're seeing new apartment buildings being built in our commercial or expanded commercial zones, because we don't have adequate A1 zoned land available. So we will be showing some slides here in a little bit about the potential for rezoning a few areas into potentially A1 or commercial. If we rezone to A1, then we're pretty certain that that's where our multifamily would go, and that's how we would sort of control or understand where that would be developed in the future.
Okay. Then my other question is, how will setbacks and buffers be affected by these smaller sizes?
So there are no changes proposed to setbacks, but we did talk about some buffer changes at the last meeting that had general agreement. It was the buffers in addition to setbacks that we were talking about, not the existing setbacks.
Yeah.
So we would keep those setbacks in place. And so your building envelope gets smaller if your lot gets smaller and your setback.
Because that's what I was wondering with this 5,000 square lot sizes.
Correct. The one change, and we don't have a slide for it this evening because it had general consensus, was changing the lot coverage when you have an ADU. So that one does change, but the setbacks stay the same. If you recall that. The one last point I guess I would like to make too is just bringing it back to the first row of data here, that the R1 zone, the only change proposed to your R1 zone is that state mandated duplex lot size minimum. That's, the majority of your residential zoning is R1 and maybe R4, but I think I read in your H&A that over 70% of your housing is single family detached.
Yeah.
So we're still, Scappoose will still be Scappoose. We will still keep that low density as our primary source of housing, and we're not proposing to add any density to that outside of the duplex minimum lot size mandated by the state. So I always like to keep that in mind, that what we're really talking about, like Lori said, a limited amount of A1. If we rezone, if we expand the UGB and add more A1, these standards would take place in those places. But in your existing city limits and what you envision for what you see right now, minimum impact, your existing neighborhoods will remain your existing neighborhoods.
Is there anyone online that has a question? And Jay? Oh, Brian?
Is the state mandating any changes to our parking requirements?
Yes, and we have a slide for that.
Related to duplex.
Just for other members, the relevance of that is you can have whatever size lot requirement per unit we want, but if you can't build it, you can't build it. That's why I was wondering about the parking, because what they're going to, sounds like they're about to do is we're going to talk about how we're going to reduce the parking requirement to allow these small lots to accommodate more units, which then in turn will push cars out on the street. I know, Kim, you've talked in the past that you're concerned, especially because, about too many cars being parked on streets and some of the impacts that would have.
Yeah, and
particularly in the case when we don't have streets with sidewalks.
right,
Yeah.
right.
Accessibility all around with that.
And I'm specifically, it's just related to duplex parking standards, not anything
Okay,
beyond that.
only
Just
so
duplex.
not A1.
No.
No.
Okay.
Thank you.
And so, Brian, you're right, though. So even if we say, okay, well, we're going to, allow additional density in A1, they still have to meet all their other requirements. There's open space requirements for tenants. There's parking requirements that we're not necessarily getting into right now, although we will review our code. It needs to be cleaned up. It's clunky at best to apply the code. It's a lot of just organization and formatting issues with that chapter of code. But there are times, like in the commercial and expanded commercial zone now, like where the Peace Candle apartments are, there's a minimum density, but not a maximum density. But it's basically the governor there is, can they get the open space on site that they're required to have, and can they get their parking on site? And so that ends up pretty much specifying, how many units they can build.
Heather, go ahead and continue.
Okay, next slide, please. So at the last meeting, we also were asked to show comparable jurisdictions. So we looked to see what cities in the state of Oregon had similar populations to that of Scappoose. And so we've listed what your current regulations would provide as far as maximum density. These are very, very rough. Like, they don't take into account your requirements for open space and your setbacks and things like that. So please take these as a very broad brush exercise, but just to show a comparison of where Scappoose would be in relation to other cities of similar size. So Scappoose fits right between Umatilla and Madras as far as population. So, 16 to 20 duplex units per net acre is right in the range of what other cities in similar sizes are. And again, these are all would be your A1 zoning district that we're comparing to other cities' similar high density zoning districts. I can give you a moment to take a look at that across the board. The proposed changes do put Scappoose right in kind of just the same densities as the other cities listed here.
And then remember that places like Seaside and Umatilla and Staten, these densities probably don't recognize the new changes for duplexes. I happen to know that
They do
Madras
not. Yes, thank you.
Madras does,
Okay,
because
already done theirs.
they've already done that work.
Thank you.
I'd like to comment on, I mean, Hood River is a really tough comparison with our town.
Yeah.
So first of all, their average price of a house is 700,000 versus ours is 483,000. They have natural areas that they need to worry about, and their biggest issue is they have second homeowner and vacation rentals that they're dealing with. So, which is what got themselves in the pickle that they are in. And since they are UGB constrained with regards to natural areas, that's why they went with the high density. So it's kind of like a completely left field case, I think, for comparing it to us.
I think what you're suggesting is not comparing Scappoose to Hood River. It is certainly similar size and shows what outliers some cities are.
Yeah, I think that the goal when I was doing this was to choose similarly sized and outside of a metro area as Scappoose is, to try to make sure we weren't influencing that in some way. So yeah, but do feel free to remove Hood River. That's too much of an outlier. I agree, it's very high. Although their townhouses are not as high as Madras. So Madras must have just.
Madras made some really interesting zone changes to allow middle housing in all of their zones, and they allow multifamily housing up to 24 dwelling units an acre in their lowest density zone. I just happen to have completed their housing needs analysis.
Huh.
Yes, Madras is interesting.
If there's no other comments, we can.
Did this tell you what you were hoping to see? In other words, are we talking about densities that are similar to what other cities of the size of Scappoose? We'll leave Hood River out of this for a few moments. What they've been talking about. My assessment is, a little lower, a little higher, but it's in the neighborhood. And those cities aren't. They're very rural cities. They aren't anywhere aside from Staten, anywhere near as close to an urban center as Scappoose is.
What is that time between 16, 20 on duplex, 18 and 20 time?
Thank you. The first row for Scappoose is what is in your code right now. And the second row would reflect those changes from the red crossouts on the previous slide. What's being proposed for you this evening for your A1.
Those would be in 2025.
2025, I think, was when those would have, right? If you're looking at adoption in 2024 fall, right, at hearings,
Oh, roughly.
roughly.
Yeah.
So late 2024, early 2025. Questions? Okay, we can always come back to it if something occurs. Let Beth jump in with, she put together some of these graphics. So
Sure. So some of the questions you had were, what does this look like? What do the densities look like that we're talking about? And so here we're giving you things that are in Scappoose, not a whole lot of these. And then we're giving you things in Eugene and Wilsonville. And you might say, why Eugene and Wilsonville? And the answer is because it is very difficult to come across graphics that tell you what density the housing is. And over the years, I've collected that data for Eugene and Wilsonville and rarely collected it for other cities. So ignore the fact that it is Eugene or Wilsonville and pay attention to the type of housing you're seeing there. So when we talk middle housing, we're talking, let me pull up the slide so I can look at it. What we're talking about in Scappoose is currently is certainly lower than what we're talking about proposed. And what we're looking at in Eugene is similar to what's proposed, a little bit lower. But it's hard to come up with, you know, a picture that's exactly some dwelling units per acre. So it looks denser than what you have now. We're still talking about two-story buildings. They're a little bigger buildings that are a little closer together.
And Beth, I'd just like to point out that actually our current code allows for townhouses at 17
Mhm.
units per net acre. So it would be actually similar to the density that you're showing in Eugene.
But a little higher density for triplexes and quadplexes,
Yeah.
not a huge amount higher.
Yeah.
It's hard to see the difference on the ground between like 17 and 21 dwelling units an acre.
Yeah.
So here's some more examples. In the green, I drive past this one every day. 20 dwelling units an acre. In Wilsonville, something that's pretty different. That's I believe that's probably in their Villebois development because that's what it looks like at 21 dwelling units an acre. And then quadplex you've got here on 3rd Street at 16 dwelling units an acre. So you can kind of see these look similar. The Wilsonville looks like it's set up on a hill by itself, but it's got other housing pretty close to it. It is not. Well, it is a house. It's just a house that is a triplex. It is multi-units. Yeah, if you've never driven around Villebois and you're ever down around Wilsonville when you have some time, it's very interesting. Drive around.
Part of that, honestly, is not requiring one parking space per unit in this more traditional development. If you can have all the parking consolidated, you know, on one side of the building, you end up having middle housing that looks more like single family detached
Into your microphone a little.
in some cases.
No worries. No, I think that goes to one of the important things that's hard to come up with here, which is that design is important. So here we've got some multifamily, and we're talking about multifamily that's like A1 because your A1 and your EC and C are different. So we're looking at an eightplex you've got here at 34 dwelling units an acre, and in Eugene, a different sort of multifamily building that's actually 3 stories high, in some places at least, that's at 25 dwelling units an acre. So
And
not
the proposed density for A1 in Scappoose was 28. So this is, you know, somewhere in between.
And then here's some density examples that are more like what you'd see in C and EC, where we're not proposing any code changes. So Peace Candle Apartments at 42 dwelling units an acre, which is really different than what we're proposing for A1. And then in Eugene, we've got an aerial view of something that's at 36 dwelling units an acre. Those were some density pictures.
Yeah, so just kind of looking at the percentage increase overall for the categories versus like triplex, quadplex, townhouse. So for triplex, we're looking at like a density increase of about 16%. For quadplex, we're looking at a density increase of about 50%. Townhomes change, and then multifamily is about 33%. Is there a way to kind of level that out across the categories, or would there be an advantage to that? Kind of doing a 20% across the board increase, or?
I think it becomes, I'll let Heather speak about this, but
I was just going to flip back to the slide where the actual lot changes happen. I'm trying to wrap my brain around why that is. The quadplex, I mean, so it's an exponential gain, right? So if you have a duplex, then every time you have a lot that could fit a duplex, you're multiplying by 2. If you have a quadplex, every time you have a lot that will fit a quadplex, you're multiplying by 4. So the gains get bigger, whereas the lot sizes are not double what the duplex is, if that makes sense. A quadplex minimum is not double a duplex minimum, so your number of units grows faster.
but it's the same as a triplex minimum.
Right. Okay. So your quadplex is going to net a higher percentage of new units than triplex because you can fit 4 on the same piece of property. You could fit 3 as a triplex.
And it would be strictly up to the developer to decide whether they want to go duplex, triplex.
Correct. They'd both be permitted. But again, you'd have setbacks, lot coverage, parking requirements that would come into play. So those could limit the amount of development capacity on the lot.
So, I'm sorry, I must be missing it somewhere, but so the candle is running at 42 acres per acre. Under our new proposed A1 zoning, we
We
would
were-
be at how many, we would be,
28 is what was proposed.
okay, 28, so less, okay.
Substantially less, yeah.
And then the Maple Street project, that is about as tight as I've ever seen anything. I mean, it's like, wow, somebody was creative when they figured out how to get all that on that site. That, if I'm understanding it right, that's 34.
Mhm.
So in both cases, our new zoning would be not as dense
Correct.
as what those two projects are.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right. And that's just because those were the Maple Streets in the commercial zone and the Peace Candles in the expanded commercial. Again, yeah,
So
not
completely
proposing-
complete.
completely different. For our A1, we are not proposing that type of density.
I had a question, which I don't know what the feeling of anybody is on this. With the new A1 densities, which are higher than what we currently have, a lot of people that I've talked to have a concern about heights, because I think the candle is something like 35 feet tall. Is that right?
The Candle apartment,
Yeah.
max height, it's, no, I want to say it's closer to 40 to 45.
Right, and our height limits are 50 feet in town, I believe.
So it's 60 for multifamily in the commercial and expanded commercial.
So
And I believe it's 45 for A1, but I'd have to check.
I'd like to throw out an idea. Is that maybe we go with the new higher densities for A1, but in return, we say basically can create 2 densities, one for taller buildings, one for shorter, because the shorter buildings will, I see happening with a higher density is what it does is like what happened with the candle. It pushes the heights up. They become more invasive to neighbors. So I don't know if that's something that's even functional or doable, but I would feel much more comfortable with the higher A1 densities that we have if we said contingent on a height limit of X, because what I don't want to see are 60-foot buildings or anything like that in this town. That's just too tall.
Well, we're not proposing an increase in height for A1. I believe it's currently 45.
So 5 feet taller or so than what candle is.
I think the Candle's close to 45 currently. It's 3 stories.
We're not proposing any change to the existing height limits in A1.
Okay.
Correct.
Right?
Hmm?
I don't know. I think I've asked you this question before. Just remind me. So for example, you said 60 for,
Commercial and expanded
Commercial?
commercial.
can we bring that down? We change that height, or is it that the height and you can't go lower? We can go higher, but we can't go lower? Is that?
Yeah, so taking away, trying to change that, you're essentially taking away the rights of the current property landowners with that type of zoning, saying, well, you previously got to build according to this, but we're going to reduce that ability for you. That could expose the city to some issues where we might have to pay out to those landowners who now can't use the land in the way that they had previously been able to use it. That's not something that we would like to get into. Beth, do you have more to say, or Heather?
I think that's correct. Yeah. You don't want to cause a taking that you would then be liable for. So if you were to propose a change like that, everyone who owns property in those zoning districts would be entitled to what's called a Measure 56 notice that the city is making a change to a regulation that could have an economic impact on your property. And that would provide that avenue for liability to the city.
They could make a Measure 49 claim.
Couldn't we do this? Couldn't we set our new lands that are going into UGB that are not currently in it? We could set a lower height limit on those if we so chose.
That's correct. You could even not use your C and EC as they stand today and have a different type of commercial zoning district that permits multifamily.
So pretty much we're stuck with what we got for what we got. Anything new outside of the state guidelines, what is best for the community?
Yes, and then I guess we would, if that were something we were going to entertain, we'd have to figure out, the practical application of that.
Make it too complicated for you guys to handle.
Potentially, we would want our plans to agree. We would have to, I would assume, address that in the comp plan policies as well.
The other thing you'd want to keep in mind is that we are tasked with creating land use efficiency. So if we're saying, okay, we're going to move forward and do something that's less efficient, then, okay, well, what other land use efficiency measures are we going to exchange for that? What are we going to add? Right?
I would also think about where you're going to get new commercial is I mean I don't have this in my head yet, but is likely most of it along Highway 30. And then when you're looking at new residential areas, if you've got commercial within those residential areas, I apologize for not knowing this, but I don't know if you have a neighborhood commercial zone. That might be an appropriate new zone. You don't necessarily have a lot of land in it because you don't necessarily need a lot of commercial land in amongst your residential land. But let's say you wanted to zone 2 or 3 acres in an area so that you had some commercial opportunities in that new zone that's embedded in a future neighborhood. That's where you might want to have lower height limits. That might work better and leaving the density concentrated along Highway 30, where you've got your bigger commercial areas. Those are, I think, decisions that would be, that would come after this project was done. You're going to have to do a fair bit of planning after this project is done with any UGB expansion areas, and then with urban reserves, how you want to treat that land. And you might actually look at things like master planning, that kind of thing. Master planning?
No.
Neighborhood commercial, yeah. It's a common type of zone. It's meant to be a lower intensity use.
Excuse me, I think it's actually very interesting to look at the candle because in 2018, we made that change to 60 feet. And everyone just, hey, sounds great. And, then the candle comes in, it's only 40 some feet. You're like, oh my God, it could even be another even higher. And now we can't take it back because we can't down zone or whatever. So you look at some of these changes and you go, we can never go back. Like when we make these changes, we will never, if we go to these densities, we will never be able to. Now we could slowly ratchet it up. We could do half the density changes and see how that goes and then add more density later, but we cannot do the opposite. And that's where I think we really got to think about it here and go, what are we stepping ourselves into? We've got a few nice pictures here, but 2018, 60 feet sound pretty good.
It was proposed by a citizen. I took it forward to council. It did get adopted. I don't think I ever felt that it was a good fit for Scappoose. But I guess all that to say, I think that we definitely have to show our land use efficiency measures. So we've gone through the exercise of seeing where everyone's sort of comfortable with what we're going to kind of move forward with. And it is a gradual change. But of course, that's always something to keep in mind, that we make these changes incrementally based on what the community needs. It is responding to the identified housing need that we do have right now, which the housing capacity analysis outlined. So we are trying to make some changes that will encourage housing that is needed now and in the future. So yeah, I think it is trying to just strike that balance of making some changes now and responding again in the future when it makes sense.
So can I step forward to the next slide to show you the amounts of changes we're talking about? So here we're just looking at potential capacity based on these changes on your vacant land. So we're not talking about redevelopment here. And in a lot of communities that we've been working in, as we're evaluating changes around middle housing, not generally, not generally expecting, and we're not seeing so far, tear down of existing housing and building, say, tear down of a single family detached and building a duplex, unless the single family detached was just in terrible condition. And it was a tear down anyway. So what we've got here, I will start with the R1 zone. So what we've modeled here is, what if all of your vacant land in R1, what's the maximum amount that could happen if all of that developed with duplexes? And then what's 3% of that, 6% of that, 10% of that? Because we really don't think that that it's likely that that all your low density land will develop with duplexes. We're just not seeing that happen in any of the communities that we work in. And Heather, I saw a vague nod of your head.
Well, when middle housing standards were put into place, we were told 3% was the.
That's a different 3%.
Okay.
Whole different
Sorry,
3%. Don't
sorry.
get confused with that.
I'm confused with that.
Yeah, no.
But yeah,
Sorry
no,
about that.
I agree. I think.
So, over this land base, your existing land base, and remember that you have more R1 land than you have anything else. Maybe you would see, 10% of it develop with duplexes, so another 82 units. I mean, it is possible that you would see more than 10%, but you've also got to look at your market realities, at what people are buying in places like Scappoose. And so I just don't think it would be defensible. It's not defensible even in the city of Portland to assume that all low density land will develop with something other than single family detached. So probably will come out in this land use efficiency measure to say that I'm going to guess somewhere between 25 and 50 new units might be accommodated beyond what you've got existing. We need to pay attention to some other rules that Heather was alluding to. And so we need to do that analysis a little differently than we've done here. But this is answering the question of how much might we get based on these changes that we're talking about. So in your R4, we're talking about between 5 and 18 new dwelling units, assuming that all of those would be quads. If we were assuming duplexes or tris, it would be fewer new dwelling units, of course. So maybe you are looking at 18. Let's say that quads really took off, then maybe over a 20-year period, you could be looking at twice that. But you're still not looking at a lot of new quads in your R4. Your MH, the numbers are low because there's so little land there. So I think the MH and the R4, were we talking about similar density changes between them?
The same.
Yeah.
Okay. So the numbers are just lower there because you don't have any land zoned MH to speak of. In the A1, we assumed instead of 3%, 6%, and 10%, we assumed, let's see, gosh, that is 50, 75, and 100%. You just don't have much land in A1 currently. So you wouldn't get much more on your existing land. And I would say your A1 changes matter more to land you might zone A1 in the future. You guys really have a deficit of land for A1. And if you continue having that deficit, that's certainly going to drive more development of multifamily in your C and your EC zones. So I would just consider that also.
I actually partly disagree with that statement. The reason why EC and E zoning is getting apartments is because you can rent an apartment for twice the price per square foot. So when any developer is going to, if he says you can rent something for $1 or $2, he's going to build a thing he can rent for $2. So the driving force there is the demand for apartments, then B, the economics that your commercial, you're looking at maybe $1.50 a square foot in Scappoose if you're lucky. And residential, like if you look at the Candle, they're $3 a square foot there.
And what I would say is that I think the demand for A1 land is about 8 acres or so. So we're not talking about a lot of
It's
A1.
not incredible.
No, it's not a lot of land.
When you guys looked at,
It's unmet demand.
when you looked at the reducing the size of the A1, we previously had talked about wanting to keep our ratios of single family homes in the same, give or take a couple percentage point where they are now. So we're not becoming a community of apartments. We were trying to do something like a 70-30 ratio of apartment dwellers versus homeowners and keep that going. Were those ratios looked at as far as, will this get us to that point if with the higher densities and the other recommended changes, or is that going to put us off skew?
I would say that it will not have a significant impact on those ratios because if you're changing densities in the A1 zone, it's already designated for multifamily. So the changes to your R1, which is your single family detached almost exclusively, but now duplex as well. That's only changing the minimum lot size for duplex. And like Beth is saying, up to 10% of the vacant land may develop as duplex. The other 90% develops as single family detached. I don't think so.
Okay, thank you.
Jeff?
Is it possible to have a code that specifies a minimum size for an apartment in a multi-unit?
Oh, minimum square footage, you mean?
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it's possible. I would worry about the long-term potential of innovation and of new types of housing and of limiting yourself to that. If the market calls for extremely small units, that might be where we finally see price points that work, right? So the
I
parking,
don't know how you can get smaller than 420 square feet.
remember those units still require their own parking space. They still require the open space. They require the setbacks. So you're still,
The studios are smaller.
The ones they have listed now are 432, or the size of my living room, as I like to think of it.
Well, I think what the state is trying to get at in some of the changes it's been requiring cities to do is a greater variety of housing choices. So I personally, especially with my husband, could not live in 400 square feet of space. He's got way too much stuff. My stuff is not a problem. Yeah, not a problem at all.
Rotary wheel.
But if you're looking at, say, a minimum wage worker, what can they afford? It may well be that a fairly small unit is what they can afford.
No one's ever going to be able to afford these units on minimum wage.
No, I'm not saying at the Peace Candle Apartments. I'm saying
of
in
them,
some
all
other
the-
situation.
Peace Candle are also actually comparable to other apartments in town as far as pricing per square foot.
I would agree with that. I think it has raised the market because people saw those prices and they were all saying, wow, you can get that much?
So kind of following along that line of thinking though, is it possible to require like 2-bedroom and 3-bedroom units be built alongside like 1-bedroom units, just so that we ensure that we have some rental opportunities for families rather than just single people? Is that a possibility?
I don't know that it's a perhaps it's a possibility. That's not something I would think that we would want to regulate. Just so that there's an ability for so the market to dictate what's needed, essentially. I don't know if you have any other
Yeah.
thoughts on that. That would be
That
difficult
was an
for
interesting
us.
question for me because I have not seen it.
Yeah.
I've worked in probably 12 cities on multifamily housing codes in the last 3 or 4 years. I have not seen it or heard the question,
Yeah.
honestly. So it's an interesting question for me,
Yeah.
and it brings
Interesting.
up thoughts for me of the work I've been doing for clear and objective standards regarding residential development. And so you'd have to have a clear and it couldn't be like it'd have to be a percentage, a clear cut percentage. And is it appropriate in every situation? Maybe not. You know, if maybe there's areas near some new factory type places that you'd want to really focus workforce housing, or maybe you get some sort of institutional higher learning at some point and you want to be able to make sure you can provide housing for adult students and new students. And so then you're stuck, right? So I haven't heard that question, but I haven't also seen that policy.
And I just asked because, you know, when we go back to the whole, like, what's the vision of Scappoose, which we did do as part of this exercise, which may be
Yep.
where some of this confusion stems from, that this is just a land use exercise.
Mm.
You know, people said it's a family oriented community and we want to maintain that.
Mhm.
Well, if we build a bunch of apartments, and, you know, I saw this in St. John's when I lived there and development started, it's 1 and 2 bedroom apartments, which,
Mhm.
and they're expensive, which means 2 single people move in to split the 2 bedrooms, you know, and then families that either, you know, needed to move housing and stay in the community or were trying to come into the community, they had no options
Mhm.
because single family housing was out of reach. So, I mean, I guess it just goes back to the larger question of how do we make sure that whatever we are accommodating more space for is going to be truly affordable.
Well, you would step outside of land use, honestly.
Yes.
Right, which we also did do in that one study that you referred to, the measures to
Yes.
accommodate
Mhm.
needed housing report. So we're looking at those policies as well in conjunction with zoning changes, and it's not just strictly a land use, right? Or are we not looking at those in conjunction with this?
So those were introduced as options that could be considered and implemented in the future. I don't believe it's particularly in the scope of this project to necessarily set those up or implement them. We did look at different strategies about 2 years ago, 3 years ago. At that time, the only one that council was comfortable with moving forward was the nonprofit housing tax exemption. We did adopt that provision, but could not get more than the over 50% of the other taxing districts on board with that. So it didn't go anywhere. So that was never enacted. I would say we would likely wrap this project up, and if there was an interest from council to pursue and explore some of these other options to help incentivize affordable housing, or to look at that in depth again, that would be something we would do as another standalone project, because it's not necessarily in the scope of this project. While that did identify what the options are for us, which is helpful for the committee and everyone to see what tools are available, that would likely be something we would do as a follow-up to this.
What I would recommend, I've worked with a lot of cities doing that kind of study, is when the city has completed this, and in 2025, there's almost certainly going to be grant opportunities to do that kind of study, where you're getting a grant from the state, and you're looking at, say, 3 of the most promising policies, maybe 4. You don't want to look at too many of them because they're complex and they require a lot of thought. I know that Scappoose has looked at some of them before because my colleagues had done some work with you on those kind of policies before. But it's hard to guarantee affordability. I would say if you don't have a big pot of money, it's nearly impossible to guarantee affordability. But the state is ramping up some of its funding of affordable housing. And when I say affordable housing, I mean income restricted affordable housing. So I expect there will be some more opportunities for that kind of affordability. And I'm hoping to see growth in some of the organizations that support other type of housing that is affordable to people who would live and work in a place like Scappoose. They're really tough issues.
Yeah, so I guess I'll just wrap up my thoughts with this. So when you look at what we would net here potentially, and you go back to the housing needs analysis study, so they estimate we're going to need 1,041 additional units at a 1% growth rate by 2043. This is 10%. This is not going to really give us the housing supply to change those market forces, right? I think the reason you said the candle was able to exist because we really didn't have like true market conditions because we lacked supply. This still isn't going to get us the supply to change the market dynamics to drive affordable housing, which is what the need was, which was identified in the housing need analysis.
Yes. Yes. I mean, yes.
Yeah.
Right.
Jeff.
The
Go, Jeff, you're
development in St. Helens is actually changing the dynamic of the local market, right? And when they get that whole complex, online, it is going to change the dynamics.
That's because they got a place to do it and they've got land to do it on. And they've been doing some really deliberate planning around that. Part of Scapoose's problem is that you don't have enough land. And so what this is designed to do is begin to solve, in the short term, you don't have enough land, and give you a 50-year supply of land. That way, when you do your housing needs analysis again, in say 8 or 10 years, and you've got a different forecast, there'll be a whole different methodology for doing this. And it's going to be a bigger forecast because the new methodology results in a larger forecast for reasons that I don't want to go into right here. But with the slow growth we're talking about in Scappoose, it's hard to change the market. This is an incremental step. If you want to have more effect on the market, then you're going to have to get into the types of policies that Laurie was talking about, the affordable housing policies.
The challenge with some of those, as we saw when we looked at that earlier, was in a lot of cases, if you're talking rent restricted properties and such, is that there can be a lot of staff time to enforce those things. And so with our very small staff, there wasn't a lot that we felt that we could additionally take on without more staff members to kind of implement those programs, unless it's in partnership with other partners like, NOAA or, Community Action Team or Habitat for Humanity, or we're doing something in partnership, but it wouldn't necessarily be something the city could manage in-house, doing, income checks yearly and things like that.
There are some ways to get around that.
Okay.
But you're
And
right.
we'll do a deep dive once we,
It's
start.
a lot of staff time potentially.
Mhm.
I'd like to throw out an idea. As far as affordable housing for families, there might be one thing we could look at. I'm not saying we want to do it per se, but it would have an impact. If you look at larger apartments, which would then start gearing towards family, you can end up with multiple single people splitting it, but that also provides affordable housing. In fact, that's more affordable for them than the studio in many cases. You could look at some of, and I'm not saying we want to do this per se, but we could look at larger apartments and do parking reduction. That would not take any money out of the city's coffers. What it would do is it would give the developer an incentive to build larger units. And so from my perspective, I feel like the things we need to do to create affordable housing, and I really don't think we're going to have affordable housing here in Scappoose in a meaningful way. It's just not the market. But things that we can do should not impact the tax base for the city in a significant way, because then it just transfers burden onto other people who may or may not be able to afford it. But if there are some things like going to, let's say, a 3-bedroom apartment, well, what is the current code requirement? Is it 2.5?
2.
2? So it's already pretty low. Yeah, I don't know if there's things like that we could consider,
Yeah.
but there might be something where we could make it a little easier for developers to build larger apartments to encourage them without creating a burden on the city. And And
Yeah.
you might have some ideas on that, Lori.
Not off the top of my head right this second, but what I was gonna say is, there's certain developers in town who always build 3-bedroom units because they know that if they build it in a way that it's a very comfortable place to live, that they will have long-term tenants. And Will Kessie, when he builds his duplex or quadplex, I believe they're always 3-bedroom. He has a certain plan he always builds. The Holmesons, the fourplex, the quadplex we saw, those are all three-bedroom units. And so, I think that the seasoned developers know kind of what their market is, who they want in their places, and they do a really good job at that.
So you're saying it's probably
There's some
adequate.
balance there, I do see. Yeah,
So you feel like it's probably good as is then?
perhaps.
Okay.
Yeah.
I just want to call attention to the fact that we're at 7:20. And I think Heather has a few more slides. And then I think we need some direction from you if we're going to get direction about the changes that we proposed a few slides ago, lot sizes, and then the next few slides. So is it okay to go on to the next few slides?
Yes.
Thank you.
Can I comment on something that Brian said real quick? So when you said market, I think the clarification is that Scappoose is not necessarily an affordable housing market. I think it's because of our lack of transportation. Don't have good transportation.
Public,
that would
yeah.
get- Also clarify that.
Thank you.
Okay. So we're going to skip back to me taking notes rather than Heather taking notes.
Thank you, Beth. Yeah, so we alluded to this earlier. Brian brought up the question, how does parking get changed with HB 3395? And so we did get clarification on this. Currently in your code, 2 spaces per dwelling unit are required for a duplex, which is 4 for a duplex. But once we hit that date, June 30th, 2025, we are limited to a maximum minimum, as I like to think of it, of 2 spaces per duplex. So that is what we can mandate. That is what the code will need to change to. And I know, in fact, we started looking at per bedroom based on our conversation at the last meeting. That was where we were headed. And then we got the news that we needed to stop and just change it. So this is where we are.
So when you say 2 spaces per duplex,
Mhm.
they have 2 single-car garages.
Mhm.
And then they have a pad in front of them,
Mhm.
enough room for a car. That's 4 spaces.
Yeah, if someone wanted to build it that way.
Basically, the new mandate is, and you have a setback, so you're basically mandating no garages.
They could choose to do what
They could choose to, but they won't have to provide
These are just
garages
the
anymore.
minimums. Yeah.
They won't have to provide garages, which
don't-
again, the market might
You don't have
dictate
to
today.
provide a garage now.
Right,
Right. They
They
could
have
put all 4.
outside, okay. Okay, thank you.
Any questions about duplex parking? Not much we can do there. Just wanted to make sure you were aware of it. Slide, please. There's a lot on this slide. This is your cottage cluster standards. So the current standards are listed on the left side after the for this left column. The Oregon Model Code is the language that was used by the Scappoose Measures to Accommodate Needed Housing report. Those recommendations were made in there. So we went through and talked about those with your staff and what changes those might be. And after a long conversation, your staff said, I feel like we should maintain our existing standards. We've had some development here of cottage cluster standards at the minimum of what the
Yeah.
or had it proposed. Sorry.
We saw the site plan and
Saw the
it
site
was
plan.
tight, and I don't think it's in our best interest to go any less than that.
So your staff is recommending that you don't make any changes to your current cottage cluster standards. Any questions or comments about that? We would not move forward with any changes. Those changes would be things like reducing how close the buildings are on site to each other, what size the common open space is, some of the setbacks, and the parking requirements.
So is this a code that we don't have to by law?
You don't have to make changes by law. These would be strictly land use efficiency measures to get more efficient use of the land. But as Lori was saying, in the site plan that she's been provided, it's a pretty efficiently used piece of land as is. current proposal. We'd like to move forward with not proposing changes. Okay, next. And then this is just a reminder that we were doing housekeeping amendments, and then we'll be bringing some considerations straight to decision makers and not spending time here at this body with things that need to be considered by the Planning Commission and City Council. Lori just wanted to make sure that we were clear with you that there might be things that happen at a Planning Commission or City Council work session or hearing that you're like, we never talked about that, and it's because it's policy decision rather than this project based. All for my side.
So let me ask you, Heather, our next step, I think, is making some changes to the code, doing some red line. And we'll be talking to the City Council and Planning Commission in early September, asking for recommendations. And of course, most of the changes are here. Do you have a recommendation that you'd like to take forward to City Council or Planning Commission about the middle housing and the multifamily housing in A1? These proposed changes.
And again, these changes were based on our conversation, our previous meeting, and had kind of general consensus outside of the changes based on the housing HB 3395 for duplexes. We move forward with these, take them to your planning commission and vet them, see if they go. Your city council, it's a joint,
Are you talking about all of them or are you talking about a specific one right now?
all of them.
All the red lines. It seems like what we might do is take these forward and say, you have some concerns about the middle housing and the multifamily housing changes, and you would like your City Council and Planning Commission to discuss those.
I would like to see something done on new A1 housing that maybe gets, I'm pretty certain, Scappoose designates height on buildings differently than a lot of people realize. When you specify a height in Scappoose, on a sloped roof, it's to the middle point of that roof. So if we say we have a height of 45 feet, it's not actually 45 feet. It could be 60. It's not a flat roof.
We may have cleaned that up during
Did you
the
clean that
last
up?
code change.
Oh, if you
I
cleaned
can
it
get
up, you
back
cleaned
to
it
you
up.
on that.
What I was thinking was, what I would feel comfortable with is adopting as is, except that we put some sort of height restriction on new A1 housing.
Well, that's at 45, but let me check about our height definition for you.
Okay.
This would be at the 45, not the C. And
Yeah, but even at 45, because what I'm visualizing is people losing views, and it's, you know, like Pat said earlier, our guest, she's talked about she moved here before the small town feeling, as a lot of people did. If we start lining our highways with, or close to the highways with 45-foot tall buildings, even without sloped roof issue, it's still going to have a different feel. Keep in mind too, the Candle looks that tall, but it's actually much lower than the highway. So if it was above grade, it would look incredibly tall. In other words, if it was on a hill, on, let's say, anywhere on the south side of outside of current city limits, on any of those properties that kind of front Old Portland, between Old Portland and the highway, which I'm one of them. But if we put a 45-foot tall building there, it would look absolutely monstrous because we're starting off 15 feet above the highway. So I would think I'm fine with this. I'm not real happy about the state mandates, but they are what they are. But to get that, need to feel comfortable with that 1,500 foot on the A1 high density, I think we could have lower height requirement on new land, not non-existing, obviously, because that would put the city in jeopardy. That would kind of try to maintain the atmosphere of the community that a lot of people would like to see. So,
I think Lori's looking at that code language right now just to clarify whether that changed how.
But even without that, it would still be an issue. If with it, it would be an additional issue.
So you'd say lower than 45.
On A1, not for existing, because we can't do that, but for, and not substantially. Well, let's find out about the hip roof.
We did change it.
You got it. So we don't
It's to
have
the
that.
highest elevation. It's to the highest point of the structure.
Okay, so you did clean that
We
up.
cleaned it up during the last round.
Okay. Well, I still think that we might want to have a lower height requirement on 1,500 feet, just because I think that if that's not on a sunken property, it's going to have an incredibly imposing feel in the town. And it's also going to block people's views.
I'm not an expert in this in any way, but I have looked at our large parcels of land that we have existing right now, and I just don't see that we have space like the Candle apartment property within our current area.
No, I'm not talking about our current area. I'm talking about for the
GB expansion.
UGB expansion. So what I'm saying
It'd
is
still be more on the fringe. This
Yeah, on the fringe.
expansion will be on the fringe.
Right. And the other thing I might note too is that, for a 3-story building, a 45-foot height for a commercial type design. I know it's residential, but it's considered by a building code.
Right.
Yeah, that 15 feet per story is kind of what you need to be able to make sure you can get the full 3 stories. So that's kind of where that 45 comes from.
they are partly built into the hill, aren't they? A little bit there.
Well, I don't know
With the Candle?
specifically about the
Candle,
Yeah, I thought they had a little.
the elevation of Second Street's obviously lower
right.
than Highway 30.
Okay. I'll go with whatever the group wants to go with.
I think that's a great point, though, that UGB areas are new areas, and so you're not impacting existing.
Well, and I mean, talking about the view, you don't live in a flat neighborhood to have a view. I mean, what are we looking at? So, and my biggest concern is not allowing any more apartments, and I don't know if this is okay. No more apartments in our commercial land, so we don't have Highway 30 loaded with apartment complexes, so we can have some kind of commercial space.
Again, that would be removing an existing use where we get into this category of a takings claim where the city's then liable to pay the property owners because, we've taken away use that they previously enjoyed. I don't know how far it's gone back. It's gone back quite some time that we've allowed multifamily in our commercial zones. So that's not necessarily something we would be able to just remove from the code at that time. I think the way to get at it is to have more A1 zoned land available for development.
I think Beth just mentioned to me as well, there is some state law about allowing multifamily housing in commercial zoning
It's a
districts.
new requirement. I
Right.
can't remember which House bill it came out of,
Yeah.
but the state is requiring cities to allow multifamily housing in commercial areas.
Government.
I know.
So
For housing anywhere we can get it.
I hear communism.
Yeah.
and housing.
So I'm going to take us back to this.
One question real quick. So to summarize, so what Kim said, I didn't look at her math, but these changes will give us very small percentage toward what we need.
Right.
Yep.
So
That is-
that's where we look at other
Right,
options. as well.
so, it's barely putting a little ripple,
Mhm.
what we have to do.
So they're.
But you-
We have to make a ripple, though.
But we have to make how much ripple?
Well, it's not clear.
Right, that's exactly right. That's
And that
a
is
tough
the
one.
UGB process in the state. It's not clear, but we do need to make a good faith ripple.
And
this is what
these
we can do.
changes would apply to newly zoned land if you use those zoning designations to zone new land. In other words, if you had new A1 land, then you'd be able to build, you'd actually have, a few acres of land where you could build something that was just a little bit denser than what you're allowed to now.
Right, because the exercise of going through how many additional units we would get, that's for existing land, not the expansion we're talking about, which we do need,
For any rezoning,
or rezoning.
that's not included in your table.
Yeah.
No, and there's some adjustments we'll have to make based on this, but we need to start getting these numbers nailed down some.
Jeanette, do you have a question?
Yeah, I just thought what Brian was saying as far as height question. I'm not an expert in this either, but can the rule or regulation code be not necessarily where the land touches the building? Can it be, say, sea level? I'm not sure. I don't know what Caboose is. Are we?
No, it's based on the finished grade.
Has to be on the ground, so it can't be something like
It starts getting really
500 above.
complicated.
Like, we need to be able to, yeah, we need to be able to check that. We need to be able to see it on the plans and verify kind of that that makes sense. So having it tied to something tangible for us to know.
I was just saying the question if, something higher and then, so
So, yeah, and the way our code is actually written, it's the average elevation from 20 feet out from the building. So if there's like, say, a slope or something, it takes that into account. So it's the average elevation 20 feet out in every direction of the property. You get that average, and then it's up from there, the 45 feet or whatever.
So one question for Lori. So is there a concern that as, let's say the UGB stuff, everything we've heard, like we might go south, right? That might be a
Sure,
spot,
yeah.
which is closer to Portland. So is there a concern from a planning perspective that that land will become prime high density apartment land where you're saying, okay, now it's only 17 miles to Portland or 16 miles or whatever. And so as you enter Scappoose, it's just high density buildings on both sides up until a certain point.
So really, as far as the land use form goes, you want your commercial, more center in town, and the density kind of decreases as you go out. You'll see on the next slide that we're going to show that we are proposing some areas for potential rezone. One of those areas being south of kind of the Fred Meyer area and the senior center bread store. Here we go, the orange there. So that's south of like where the senior center bread store is, that little section of Dutch Canyon that connects in with Highway 30. It's about 4 different lots south of that area. There's 8 buildable acres there. Now, granted, our current UGB goes all the way down to Johnson's Landing, essentially. And then I forget what it's called on the other side of the highway. Sorry. Thank you. So our current UGB extends that far down already. Our comp plan map designates that area that goes all the way down to Bonneville as commercial. So we're already extending down that far. We may look at, well, we will be looking at the lands south of Callahan, sort of all the way down into that area towards Bonneville. However, there would be, if that were to come into the urban growth boundary, then we would be looking at how do we designate it on the comp plan map. This all gets planned ahead of time. So it wouldn't be like, oh, all of a sudden there's apartments there. There would have already been thought placed to that. Is it going to come in as general residential or suburban residential? General residential, would allow some more density, whereas suburban residential is going to be your R1 zone. And so that would have been planned out already. The further you are from sort of the town center, the lower the density would go. But obviously, if you're right next to Highway 30, it kind of makes sense to have a higher density there. And so it wouldn't just kind of spring up, I guess is my point. There would be thought behind it, and there would be a decision made essentially by council as to how that should lay out in the future and what types of uses that would support.
But is there, like the UGB expansion is, we have limited land, so are they going to dictate that you need to have higher densities in our UGB expansion as well?
Well, let's get to that in a little bit.
No, the answer is no. It's based on what you've got in your housing needs analysis and the land use efficiency measures. So these land use efficiency measures would increase your densities by a little bit, but it wouldn't fundamentally change. And by a little bit, what I mean is I suspect we'll probably use a 3% increase in density. And if you were 5 dwelling units a unit, that would take 5 dwelling units an acre, that would take you to 5.15 dwelling units an acre. So it's a very small increase in density. And the UGB expansion process doesn't require that you designate more land at higher densities than your housing needs analysis says that you need.
It's roughly, yeah, because our housing needs analysis is roughly planning for the next 20 years to have the same mix of single family and multifamily, essentially. It's like a 70-30 mix.
How much A1 are we talking about bringing in under with the new UGB? acres?
I kind of remember like 8 acres, and I think it's going to go down from that a little bit.
Okay. So not a huge-
Especially if we're talking about rezoning some land to A1, then it would go down a little from there. We've got a fair bit of bean counting that we have to do.
I can imagine each time a number changes, one place.
It ripples.
It ripples and makes your Excel spreadsheets explode.
Yeah.
No, happily they're designed for that.
They already have it all built.
It won't explode. So is there anything else you'd like to talk about
Are there any other questions online about these recommendations?
None right now.
Okay, so these recommendations will be taken to the planning commission next,
Mhm.
the idea?
It'll be a joint planning commission city council work session.
Session, okay.
And I think what we'll try to do is summarize some of what we've heard here shortly, briefly. And then obviously we've got some planning commissioners here and some city councilors here, and they can chime in if we didn't get it right.
Good.
So, okay. So then I do want to return to this map for just a moment. And I'm going to ask Lori to tell you the genesis of some of these potential changes. But some of them, one or two of them at least, are essentially just cleanups of your existing zoning, like rezoning a little bit of land from A1 to the public lands recreation because it's already in a park. And some of these I think are based on discussions you've
Yeah,
had.
I'll just run through this really quick. So starting furthest north with the red and bluish parcel. So there's 2 lots there. The landowner has already used the red lot for commercial uses. These 2 lots are still in the county. The red one's already being used for commercial uses in the county. They're both designated to come in as industrial if they did annex in. However, with the commercial uses already on the northern parcel and his desire to rezone to commercial in the county at this time, we've already had meetings with the county planners. The thought was, and he has been agreeable to see if this might occur as part of this project to redesignate those 2 parcels as commercial on our comprehensive plan map so that if they ever did annex in, they would have commercial designation instead of industrial. This seems to make sense from a land use perspective. For us, it's near the entrance to the airport. There is already the barnstormer and just to the north of this area. And so we would look at that. So it's a willing property owner who's desiring this and it fits with the overall need for more commercial. Moving further south and a little west, there's the 2 blue lots. Again, not a ton of there's 4 buildable acres here. They front on Highway 30. These are designated currently to annex in as industrial. However, the landowner is interested in seeing if those could be redesignated to a commercial designation so that if they were to annex in, that those would become, or is that already, one of them's already in this, the lighter blue's already in city limits, the darker blue's in the county. So again, wanting to go from industrial to commercial designation. It's on Highway 30. From a planning perspective, there's not a conflict there. So we would consider that. Moving further south, there's this orangey kind of parcel. That is the parcel that the city acquired recently. It's currently zoned R1. However, there's a public park planned for that parcel, and so we would like to rezone it to public park land. Likewise, with the Chief Concomly Park parcel, just further south to that, the green. It is almost entirely within the floodplain. I believe technically it's considered 1 buildable acre, but it is built out with park use currently. You cannot build apartments in the floodplain, so we used it as parkland. It's already built out. So again, we would look to rezone that to parkland. It's currently A1, but again, it can't be used for apartments anyway. Further south is the orange area that we spoke of earlier. The proposal or the thought is to potentially, that's R4. I'm not sure that you'd necessarily want medium density, kind of middle housing between a highway and another collector road, Old Portland Road. So the thought was to potentially rezone that to high density residential A1 or to expanded commercial, which is the zoning directly to the north of that is expanded commercial. So it would sort of be a natural progression of that. But again, if we want that control over where the multifamily would be located, then that might make sense to rezone to A1. Again, we have a willing property owner who's very interested in the possibility of having that rezoned. So those were our thoughts on those. They kind of make sense to us, and with the property owners that are interested in these changes, it's kind of a win-win. Questions?
And these are also land use efficiency measures, except for the parks pieces. Those are just cleanup.
Yeah, so I do have a quick question. So when I saw the latest version of the Parks Master Plan, there's allowance for some pocket parks in there. Like, are we thinking about?
We don't rezone prior to. So in other words, the Parks Master Plan might identify future parcels for acquisition or development. That doesn't mean that we would then go rezone those parcels ahead of the city acquiring them for a park use, et cetera. The existing property owners are able to maintain that land until such time that the city could purchase the property and develop it into a park.
But in the bean counting, we would count those beans to make sure that if it was 3 acres of land, say, in those kind of parks, that we were accounting for need for 3 acres of land.
Yeah, so that is the tie-in. So whatever that total acreage is that the Parks Master Plan says we need to have available for future park use, we do account for that, like at our UGB expansion as well, to make sure that we could accommodate, but we're not going to, show that on our zoning map or make that change ahead of time.
Okay, so it's coming out of the buildable land inventory, the balance of all that?
So if you have 38 acres of land in R1 that's surplus, and we're talking about things that would be in R1, then if there was 3 acres, I'm just making up numbers, then you'd say 38 minus 3, 35 acres is your surplus of R1 now. Okay. And you account for that, how you might use that surplus in other places, like looking at rezoning here. None of this is really A1, R1 that was counted in your buildable lands inventory anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Oh.
Or if something's R1 and it's in the county and we want to bring it into the urban boundary, I hope I'm saying this correctly, it doesn't necessarily change the zoning, right?
So it doesn't have city zoning until it comes into the city.
Okay.
For us, it's designated suburban residential. So it'll say on our maps SR. Suburban residential means when it annexes in, it goes R1. It gets the R1 zoning designation when it comes in. So the comprehensive plan map is like the broad overview for the plan, but it's not until it gets annexed in that it takes one of our zoning code designations.
So like, just for example, like the Bonneville, I don't know what they're called, but they're like on acre lots.
Or smaller, yeah.
So that neighborhood couldn't necessarily go into like R4. And now whomever sells that property can sell their back half for density.
So we have to look at all of that, because if that were to come in, we would have to see, because it's already built out, I assume we would be looking at like what density does it most closely match, and then probably designate it that way on the comp plan map, so that if they did annex in, they would be somewhat aligned with what our, current zoning is.
So a private landowner could sell their land with their home to like an apartment complex or a multifamily?
Only if whatever zoning designation it received once it annexed into the city limits
city
supported it.
the city decides.
Yeah, the city would decide how they're going to designate it on the comp plan map, and then would decide what it gets zoned as once it comes into the city. Just because the urban growth boundary might extend down that far and come into the boundary, that doesn't mean it can annex in for quite some time, because you can't annex in unless you're congruent or abutting current city limits, and there's quite some distance between those areas. So, cities have to kind of grow in a sequential way. You can't leapfrog. Yeah. So it just, whatever use they're proposing in the future, if they have this back parcel that seems like it can be partitioned, still has to meet our codes as far as what that zoning district says is allowed there. So if it came in as R4, they couldn't build apartments there.
They could build.
They might be able to build a duplex in the back or, something else.
So shall we go on and talk very briefly about the UGB process?
Yes.
Got a few more maps for you. It's mostly clarifying a little bit of what we talked about last time. So we start by establishing the study area, which is all land within a half mile of the city, which is that solid line. And then all exceptions area, which is in Columbia County commercial and residential zoning, shown in the yellow color or the cream color on this map within 1 mile. So that's the study area. That's the lands we're considering. Notice that we're at the half mile, getting awfully close to the Multnomah County line. Do not believe we will be crossing that line. We look at constraints, the same constraints we looked at in your buildable lands inventories. In a few minutes, we turn these constraints just into hash marks, sort of merge them all together so that you know where they are. And then we look at the priority for inclusion in the UGB. According to OAR 660, 0024, 0067, which specifically says that the first priority is urban reserve land, exception land, and non-resource land. You don't have any urban reserve land or non-resource land, but you do have a lot of exceptions areas around the UGB. So we are looking first at within a half mile of the UGB, all of the exceptions areas. All of the areas that you see on this map that are hashed with brown, black, that's all constraints. So you can see there's a lot of constraints. All of the green stuff is either high value resource land or low value resource land. Just to follow through on the priorities for inclusion, there's no marginal land in this county. So you don't have any second priority land. Third priority land is the low value high farmland. That's in the light green. You see it mostly over to the west. And then the fourth priority, if you don't have enough land in the first or third priorities, is the high value farmland. That's shown in the darker green. So we've gone through, and within a half mile of the UGB, we chopped it all up into areas and left out big swaths of land that are just plain constrained. So we're not considering those. You wouldn't consider those in bringing those into the UGB. So that's why you see areas like this up next to number 2, outside of an area that's numbered or lettered. So the numbered areas are your first priority land, and the lettered areas are your third priority land or fourth priority land. The lettered areas are your first priority land, the exception zoning.
Numbered.
I'm so bad at this. Numbers 1, 2, 3, 4 are your first priority land.
Is that in order to? Is it just the numbers? Just
Random. They're just semi-arbitrary.
Random.
We just kind of went around. They're not in any priority order. So here we've tried to fade back to just highlighting the first priority land. So these are areas that are in exception zoning. You've got quite a lot of that land around the city. And it doesn't consider any of the areas that are third or fourth priority. So any of your low value farmland or your high value farmland. We're not considering any of that here. We know that as we were talking about the UGB and the urban growth boundary, that we were looking at, I can't remember if it was about 300 or 400 acres.
I think it was under 400, but.
Yeah, let's just call it 400 for the moment. Well, the requirement is that your study areas, your sub areas here, which have numbers, have at least twice the amount of land in them as what you're trying to solve for. So since we're solving for around 400 acres now, it'll be a little less when we talk about it again. In total acres, that's about 1,600 acres we're looking at. When you take it and you say what unconstrained acres, it's 900 acres that we're talking about. So we have at least twice the amount of land need that we're going to have. So we have satisfied that requirement with these study areas, and the next steps are to evaluate. Well, the next steps, honestly, are to divide up some of these big study areas into 100-acre parcels, because that's what you have to do. So we'll have a lot more study areas than, I think we've got 11 of them right now.
So, pardon me, just so I'm clear,
Mhm.
you're losing me a little here.
Sure.
So the 909 net acres,
Mhm.
that is in exception land?
That's an exceptions land that's not constrained.
That's the net exceptions land, not constrained. And we're talking about a UGB expansion of approximately 80 acres-ish.
It's going to be
Yeah.
smaller than that.
Okay, well, that's fine. And so basically, we're looking from that 900, because that's got to go first. And we're going to pull 80 out of that? Is that what?
That's what you're going to do for your UGB plus your urban reserves, which will be another 300-ish.
Okay. And so these are all exception lands, which would be RR5 and that kind of thing, right?
Or commercial.
Or some there's a little bit of commercial as
Oh,
well.
commercial or this or that, but
In the
not
county.
farmland. Now,
Not farmland.
Now, if we wanted to get, we have no land for a big box store or even a supermarket in this town right now,
The population.
or the population. So could we designate some low quality farmland because the parcel sizes are large enough to facilitate a big box store or at least a supermarket?
You're assuming that none of the exceptions land is large
Well,
enough.
I'm thinking that if you're going to build a supermarket or a big box store, you're going to want it in close proximity to the highway. That eliminates a lot of this. Then you're going to want it to have easy highway access, which means a light, which eliminates more. And you're going to want it, if possible, visible from the highway. And the land,
Realistically, we don't have the population for a big box store.
well, let's say even another
We only
supermarket.
get to 10,000 people in 20 years.
Yeah.
Costco's are coming. Trader Joe's
So
are coming.
it would be, I can't think of a way to make that argument
Okay.
successfully.
Okay, that's all I wanted to know. It seemed like there was some parcels that were low quality farmland that might.
Well, you don't have all the land here that's next to the, that is to the west. I can't actually get backwards.
There's a parcel, I think that's owned by the Havlicks, that's off of Havlick, down kind of at the, past Poltano's down there, that is not, I don't believe it's in a floodplain.
This is
It's high value
quality farmland here.
I thought there was a 20-some acre parcel. I thought there was a 20-some acre parcel there that was, level 3 soils.
It's farmland.
It may be-
We have plenty of exceptions land.
Okay, so it's
It may
just not going to happen.
It's off the table.
Okay,
It may be level 3 soils, but a lot of this is designated as prime farmland through other sorts of designations.
okay. Well, they did plant nursery stock there. When I saw that, I thought, oh.
Yeah. So this is,
Sorry, excuse me, Lori, just a quick question. We talked previously about a land swap, which would basically be Dutch Canyon in the UGB area that's full of large homes, and then maybe swap it to south of California.
We did speak with DLCD about that, and it did not.
we spoke with your engineer and the attorney and DLCD, and basically came to the conclusion, given what you've got there, that you just can't reasonably do a land swap, because a lot of the land there that you'd want to swap out is unbuildable because of constraints like steep slopes, and you have to swap out buildable land for buildable land. You can't swap out constrained land for buildable land. So that's why that,
Once we got clear on that, we understood it was not going to be an option for us here.
It doesn't hurt us either then, since it's
Right.
constrained, it doesn't count against us.
Correct. It's not in our
So it's-
buildable.
so it's just sitting there and it's doing its thing.
the
Right.
problem is that that land in that area is difficult to serve. And it appears as though it's buildable and it could theoretically be buildable. But the costs of services are prohibitive at this point from building it.
So
So that was reason for
since
looking.
it's considered constrained though, it doesn't count against our acreage, right? Or am I
The
wrong?
constrained part of it doesn't, but there's some buildable parts of it. Like if you look at
Okay,
where
I
I'm
see.
pointing to right here.
Okay.
And the problem is the cost of getting the services down through here. And you've got some land at the far edge that's already on city, I can't remember if it's water.
Water.
Yeah. And so that makes it that
It's
much
already
more
being
complicated.
served, right?
So, but yeah, we did look at that.
Do you need any decisions on this part of it?
No, but Kim has a question.
Okay, we have a question in the back. Go ahead, Kim.
I'm sorry, that Kim.
Quick question on parcel 2. So that would
Uh-huh.
not be considered currently congruent to the city limits, right? So we would not.
We'll be ruling out parcel 2 based on an evaluation of needing a big cherry stem through where you've got what was that, a quarry. That one will be ruled out.
Yeah, I just want to say one thing. I don't know, it doesn't appear on your sub areas there that there's a strip of land, as Lori is aware, between south of Scappoose, between Highway 30 and the railroad tracks. That's all zoned for commercial. And so
Are you talking about in the area that's colored green?
yes, because there's strip of land there.
Oh,
That's all
yeah.
there's commercial properties there that the county, it's all commercial, and Brian is well aware of all those. And it's developmentally, and I don't know if that's what you guys have considered as constrained land, because you got the railroad and the Highway 30.
I don't think we've considered that as constrained, but it is in high value farmland. I mean, that's the designation in that area when you, I know.
No, I mean, I mean, that area, but we have those strips of land, all those strips of land, they are all zoned for commercial.
You're talking about on the other side of the highway, aren't you?
On the east side of the highway, between the railroad tracks, where the putt-putt golf used to be.
Oh, yeah. We'll double check
All-
that.
And all those those little strips of land.
Oh,
We'll
I
double
see.
check,
She's talking about like where the gas station is.
Yeah,
the
yeah.
Golf and the pot shop.
Yeah, all that strip of land. South, on the southeast side of Highway 30.
We'll double check the zoning on that.
Huh? Yes, yes, yes. Yeah, we have all that, and that there's a strip of commercial all in exception area. Those are all,
It may well be that in the maps we have, that's not in the data correctly.
okay, so yeah, I just wanted to bring that up because that is, those are. Because those properties are skinny properties, they're not on, they're on wells and septics, and it's very constrained, and so, but they're always zoned for commercial.
You know, it may well be if you zoom way in on this, it may well be that we've got that in there.
I think,
It's just that they're so small, they're not showing.
I think they're like 100 feet deep or so.
So small.
I think it is, Beth.
I think it is. You can sort of see it. It's just, we'll make sure that it's in our area for.
Beth, what are the next steps here so we can wrap up? It's past 8
Our
o'clock.
next step is we're going to continue analysis on this. And we'll bring you back some more information when we next time talk.
Bigger.
Pardon?
So it's bigger and like with some street references.
Oh, we'll be zooming in on some of the areas. For now, we couldn't give you, I know, we couldn't give you that kind of detail here. We need to start, what's the word? Start zooming in on some of the areas. So.
Well, thank you, Beth and Heather tonight, and Lori too. And the next meeting is
September 12th.
September 12th. Okay.
Can I ask one procedural question on this? So you guys will take this information to work session with the planning commission and city council. So do we need to approve the zoning changes to then apply for the UGB? Like, what if we make these changes in a good faith effort and then the UGB gets denied? Are we stuck? Or do we say, hey, here's if you give us the expansion?
No. It would all go for adoption at once. So all the zone changes we discussed, the code changes, the expansion, all of it would move forward at once. But what I'm trying to remember, Beth, if the expansion itself was appealed or held up, it wouldn't negate the zone changes and the other.
No.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I'm not an attorney, but as I understand it, it would be a piece of it that would be appealed.
Right.
And not the entire,
Right.
not everything.
Right. That's
We
my
also
general
generally write our
understanding as well.
ordinances like that.
We would be stuck with the zoning changes and still not have a UGB expansion.
You would eventually have a UGB expansion. You just have to work through whatever the, I'm assuming not a remand, but whatever the challenge is to the analysis. So if somebody challenged the analysis because they didn't like how we did a part of the analysis, then, you know, we have to provide substantial evidence, and maybe it is that, you know, they've got a point, and so you have to change exactly where your UGB expansion is or something like that. But those kind of things can happen.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, thank you everyone for coming tonight. On the agenda is our next meeting dates. So thank you all. We'll adjourn. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Pat.
Hey, thank you.